January 14th, 1946. A pale, brittle cold hung over the outskirts of Kassel, the kind of winter that made chimneys smoke non-stop and turned every footstep into a scraping whisper on the frozen cobblestones. The war had been over for 8 months, but the ruins still looked fresh. Jagged silhouettes of collapsed factories, burned-out tram lines, entire neighbourhoods reduced to hollow brick shells that caught the morning frost like bones catching dust. Nothing in Kassel felt alive anymore, except the thin trails of breath that rose from people too hungry to have anything left to say. Along the road that led toward the American supply depot, once an old train warehouse before the bombs gutted half of it, clusters of German civilians walked with the same quiet resignation. Mothers with sunken cheeks. Old men who once held pride like a badge on their chest, now shuffling with broken posture. And children, always the children, moving with the unnatural stillness of the starved. Their coats were patched from curtains or scavenged bedsheets, and their shoes were sometimes nothing more than rope tied around bits of leather. Every few steps, one of them would cough the dry, hollow cough of winter hunger. On the edge of a blasted apartment block, Elsa Baumann tightened her grip on the tiny hand of her 8-year-old daughter, Lotte. Elsa had been a seamstress before the bombs came. Now she was simply another civilian trying to survive on powdered barley rations and whatever scraps could be traded for her last pair of real shoes. Her stomach had been empty since the day before, but she kept telling Lotte, "We will eat today." Somehow. She didn't know if it was a promise or a prayer. A column of American trucks rumbled slowly down the icy road, engines echoing through the broken streets. The olive-drab vehicles always drew attention. Every civilian glance tightened. Every pair of thin legs paused. American soldiers were impossible to read. Sometimes they ignored the crowds completely, hard-faced and focused. Other times, they shouted orders or waved people away from restricted areas. Rumors spread constantly. The Americans hated Germans. The Americans pitied Germans. The Americans were strict or generous or unpredictable. No one really knew. The only constant was the fear of doing anything that could be misinterpreted. Lotte tugged gently at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, they have food, don't they?" Elsa swallowed. It hurt to lie, but the truth hurt more. "Not for us," she whispered. "We must keep walking." But the trucks slowed. One of them, third in the convoy, hissed as its brakes locked against the ice and came to an uneven stop near the sidewalk. The soldiers shouted to each other in English, fast and rhythmic, impossible for most Germans to follow. Civilians instinctively stepped back, unsure whether this meant danger or orders or something worse. Inside that truck sat Private First Class Daniel Rourke, 23, from Akron, Ohio. His face was young but tired, eyes shadowed from too many months in Europe. He had been an aircraft mechanic during the war and had stayed for occupation duty mostly because he had nowhere else to go. His father's repair shop had closed. His mother had passed while he was overseas. Germany wasn't home. But returning to America felt like facing a different kind of wreckage. As the convoy stalled, Rourke noticed something through the gap in the canvas. A cluster of children, 6 of them, standing barefoot on the ice. Their clothes were so thin the wind seemed to push straight through them. One boy, maybe 10 years old, held a dented tin cup as if hoping it would fill by some miracle. Another girl's lips were cracked white. A third child didn't look older than 4. Rourke frowned. "Captain, we stopping here?" Captain Miles Harding, seated in the passenger side, didn't answer at first. He was staring at the children too, jaw tight. Harding had fought from Normandy to the Ruhr and had seen more destruction than he could process. Yet there was something different about children starving after peace had supposedly arrived. Something wrong in a way war could not explain. "Fuel truck ahead slid on the ice," Harding finally muttered. "We'll be stuck here a while." Rourke nodded, but he kept staring. On the sidewalk, Elsa pulled Lotte closer. "Do not go near them. Do you hear me?" Lotte nodded, but her eyes were locked on the soldiers. One of the American drivers jumped down from the lead truck, waving men toward the stalled vehicle. Others dismounted to secure the convoy. For a moment, the road filled with the noise of boots, metal, engines, a strange reminder that life existed somewhere outside the hunger. Then something unexpected happened. A soldier, thin, tall, wearing his helmet pushed back, walked toward the cluster of children. He reached into the pocket of his field jacket and pulled out a bar of something wrapped in dark paper. Chocolate. Real chocolate. Elsa's breath froze. The children stared wide-eyed as if the soldier were holding sunlight in his hand. Chocolate was something they had only heard stories about, passed around in whispers like a myth of better times. The soldier crouched down and broke the bar into small pieces, offering them gently. The children didn't move. Starvation made you suspicious, made you think anything that looked kind must have a price attached. Rourke watched from the truck bed, stunned. American soldiers were forbidden to distribute food without authorization. The rule was strict. Prevent dependence, prevent crowding, prevent chaos. But the tall soldier didn't seem to care. "Come on," he said softly. "Take it. It's for you." The smallest boy stepped forward first, trembling. When the chocolate touched his palm, he stared at it as though it might vanish. Then he ate it, slowly, carefully, like it was something holy. And then the other children moved. But Elsa didn't move. She held Lotta still, her breath tight in her chest. Her daughter looked up at her, whispering, "Mama, please." But Elsa feared everything. Fear that accepting food would be seen as begging. Fear that the soldiers would think they were ungrateful. Fear that anything could bring punishment. Then one soldier shouted from the truck bed, "Hey Harding, we've got extra rations here, canned soup, crackers. You want us to unload some?" Harding hesitated. The rule book said no. The children's shaking hands said yes. Rourke spoke quietly. "Sir, look at them." Harding exhaled, long and tired. War had taken enough from everyone. Maybe bending a rule wasn't the worst sin in a world already filled with bigger ones. He nodded. "Give them what we can spare." Quietly. And that was when the world changed for Elsa Baumann. Rourke jumped down from the truck with a box of army rations. The other soldiers worked quickly, trying not to draw attention, handing out crackers, bits of bread, anything they could offer without emptying their own stores. Children stepped forward tentatively at first, then with open hands when they realized no one was shouting, no one was hitting them, no one was taking anything in return. Then Rourke saw Lotta. She stood beside Elsa, too afraid to approach, her blue eyes fixed on a small tin of peaches in his hand. Rourke crouched slightly and held it out to her, not touching her, not pushing it on her, just offering. Lotta looked up at her mother. Elsa felt her throat burn. She had resisted for so long, had held on to dignity like it was the last thing the war had not taken. But dignity didn't fill a child's stomach. She nodded, and her daughter stepped forward. In that frozen moment, under the low winter sky and the ruined silhouette of a city trying to remember how to live, Elsa realized something she had never expected to feel toward men in American uniforms. Gratitude. Real. Wordless. Overwhelming. For the first time in months, she felt the smallest flicker of warmth return to her chest. Not because of the food, not even because of kindness, but because the war inside her had finally loosened its grip. She whispered, barely audible, "Danke." Rourke smiled softly. "You're welcome, Mom." And behind them, other German civilians watched in stunned silence, unable to believe what they were seeing. American soldiers feeding German children. The road outside the American supply depot remained half blocked by the fuel truck, and the cold had deepened. The wind scraped over the rubble and tugged at loose bricks, moaning through broken window frames like some ghost that refused to leave the ruins. Yet despite the bleakness, a strange and quiet shift had settled over the crowd. Hunger was still there, raw, sharp, unrelenting. But now it shared space with something else. Something unfamiliar. Hope. Word had spread quickly. Civilians who had been walking toward the market turned back. Mothers carrying toddlers hurried through alleys toward the depot. Children emerged from doorways like shadows gaining color, drawn by whispered rumors. The Americans are giving food to children. They're not turning anyone away. It didn't take long for the number of onlookers to double, then triple. But something remarkable happened. No one shoved, no one pushed. They approached quietly, hesitantly, unsure whether the generosity would continue, afraid to be seen as greedy, desperate to maintain whatever dignity remained after years of war and starvation. Rourke noticed the growing crowd as he handed Elsa and Lotte a second small tin, this one of powdered milk. He swallowed hard. "Captain, people are gathering, a lot of them." Harding glanced up from the stalled truck where he'd been coordinate repairs. His jaw tightened. Regulations flashed in his mind, warnings about mobs forming, warnings about handouts creating dependency, warnings about provoking resentment from other Allied units who had to follow the rules strictly. The responsibility weighed on him like a physical burden. But then he saw Lotte clutching the tin of peaches to her chest as though it were treasure. He saw Elsa's hollowed cheeks soften with relief. He saw the smallest children licking crumbs from their fingers as though savouring a feast. Harding sighed. "As long as they stay orderly, we keep going." "Sir," Rourke said, "we'll make sure of it." Nearby, Specialist Jim Carver, broad-shouldered, loud, and always 2 steps from trouble, began organising the growing line with surprising gentleness. "All right, folks, just keep it steady. One at a time like this. We got enough to share if you don't crowd." To everyone's amazement, the German civilians obeyed. Not because Carver shouted, but because he smiled while he said it. A simple smile. A human gesture they hadn't seen from a soldier in so long that it felt unreal. Not far away stood Friedrich Schneider, once a machinist, now a man whose ribs pressed sharply against his patched coat. At his side were his twin boys, Emil and Walter, 7 years old and trembling with cold. They stared at the Americans with expressions that hovered somewhere between disbelief and fear. Friedrich knelt down. "Boys," he whispered, "remember, take only what they give. Don't ask for more." Walter nodded rapidly. Emil's lip quivered. "Papa, will they shout at us?" "I don't know," Friedrich admitted, "but we must try." A few steps ahead stood a young American soldier, leaning beside a crate of ration cartons. He wore wool gloves, with the fingertips cut off, and his breath puffed like smoke in the freezing air. When Friedrich and the twins reached him, the soldier's eyes softened. He handed each boy a small packet of biscuits and half a can of corned beef. Walter stared at it. "For us?" The soldier nodded. "Sure is, kid." Emil swallowed. "We don't need a lot, just a little." "You're getting more than a little today," the soldier replied, pressing a second biscuit packet into his hand. "No arguments." The twins looked at their father, confused. Friedrich felt something fracture inside him, some quiet defense he had built over the last years of war, blame, propaganda, fear. This generosity made no sense to him. It felt like standing in the sunlight after living underground too long. He bowed his head. "Thank you," he whispered, unable to stop his voice from cracking. The soldier gave him a reassuring pat on the arm. "Your boys shouldn't go hungry. Nobody's kids should." Nearby, Elsa watched the world around her with a mixture of amazement and disbelief. She held Lotte close, her body trembling, not from cold, but from the shock of witnessing kindness from men she had feared only hours before. Lotte's cheeks had regained a touch of colour, and she was nibbling the corner of the biscuit Rourke had given her. "Mama," she whispered, "the Americans, they're not like they said." Elsa closed her eyes. German propaganda had been relentless. Americans hate us. Americans will punish us. Americans will let our children starve. She had believed it. Everyone had. But standing here, Watching soldier after soldier hand food to shivering children, she realized how many lies the war had carved into their minds. "They're human," she murmured softly, "just like us." As more civilians arrived, Harding took control of the situation. He ordered some soldiers to start opening additional crates, but to distribute slowly, cautiously, with dignity. "One family at a time," he insisted. "Keep it calm, keep it fair." It worked. One soldier gave out soup cans, another distributed small loaves of army bread. Others handed out powdered milk, crackers, even a few precious tins of fruit. Every time a child reached forward with a small, cold hand, the soldiers softened. Every time a mother whispered, "Danke," the soldiers nodded in quiet understanding. And yet, despite the growing warmth spreading through the crowd, fear still lingered beneath the surface. Standing apart from the others was Greta Hoffmann, a widow whose husband had been killed on the Eastern Front. She clutched her 4-year-old daughter, Annalisa, whose tiny legs could barely hold her weight. Greta's nerves were tight, her breath quick and uneven. She didn't trust this moment. She didn't trust the Americans, even if they were giving out food. The world had changed so violently, so suddenly, she no longer believed kindness existed without a hidden cost. But Annalisa tugged at her coat. "Mama, hungry." Greta swallowed hard. She looked at the soldiers. She looked at her daughter. Her instincts screamed in 2 directions at once. Finally, slowly, painfully, she stepped forward. As she approached the distribution line, an American corporal leaned down with a smile, offering a packet of crackers. But Greta's eyes went to the man's holstered pistol. The rifle slung over another soldier's shoulder, the uniform she had been raised to fear. Her hands trembled. She could barely lift them. The corporal noticed. Gently, he placed the crackers on the ground beside her feet. "For the little one," he said quietly. "Take your time." Greta stared at him. No threat, no shouting, no demand, just a quiet gesture, giving her space, giving her dignity, letting her choose when to accept. She knelt slowly, picked up the packet, and placed it into her daughter's hands. Annalisa smiled. Greta felt tears burn her eyes for the first time since before her husband died. 2 worlds, enemy and enemy, stood inches apart, no longer divided by hatred or surrender or fear, but by something simpler, the shared understanding that children should never starve. Nearby, Harding glanced over the growing line and whispered under his breath, "This wasn't in the manual, but maybe it should have been." Meanwhile, further down the road, a German man in a long wool coat watched the entire scene unfold. He was older, with squared shoulders and a face etched by years of hardship. His name was Heinrich Falmer, once a respected schoolteacher, now a quiet survivor of a country in ruins. He studied the Americans closely, not with suspicion, but with thoughtful calculation. He whispered to himself, "If this is the new world, perhaps there is hope after all." At the edge of the convoy, Rourke opened another box of rations. As he worked, he noticed the faintest flicker of a smile on Lotta's face. Small, fragile, but real. It sparked something in him he hadn't felt in months. Purpose, humanity, maybe even redemption. Children were laughing now, soft, thin, uncertain laughs, but laughter nonetheless. And in a city where laughter had once been buried under rubble and fear, it sounded like a miracle. For one long, unexpected moment, the war truly felt over, and the German civilians, who had braced themselves for humiliation, punishment, or indifference, found themselves overwhelmed by something entirely different: American soldiers, giving food to their children. By late afternoon, the pale winter light had begun to fade, turning the sharp ruins of Kassel into long, jagged silhouettes against a darkening sky. The convoy was still stuck, mechanics working with numb fingers, tools slipping from frostbitten gloves. But by now, the tension that had once filled the street had transformed into something neither side could have predicted that morning. The fear was gone. Not completely, fear leaves slowly, but enough to allow something else to take its place. Rourke stood by the back of the ration truck, stacking empty crates into a neat pile. Around him, the steady quiet of exhausted satisfaction filled the air. Children sat on the curb with biscuit crumbs on their lips. Mothers held tins of precious food to their chests like treasures. Fathers kept their arms around their families, not to protect them from soldiers, but simply to steady themselves against the emotion of it all. The Americans had not solved everything. Hunger still hovered in their eyes, and the ruins of Kassel were still ruins. But for the first time since the war had ended, many of these people were seeing a glimmer of what peace might look like. Not a treaty, not a proclamation, but a gesture. A human hand extended when it wasn't required. A little boy named Emil, one of Friedrich's twins, approached Rourke shyly, clutching a small, dented metal cup. "Sir," he said in halting German, "may I ask, is there more?" Rourke knelt to eye level. "We're almost out, kiddo, but if I find more later, I'll make sure you get some." Emil nodded slowly, then hesitated. He glanced around, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something tiny, barely the size of a matchbox. A carved wooden rabbit, rough, imperfect, clearly whittled by small hands. He held it out with both palms. "For you," he whispered. Rourke's breath caught. He looked at the carving, one of the few toys a starving child might own, and realized the meaning of the gift. This wasn't payment. It wasn't obligation. It was gratitude from someone who had nothing left to give except the one thing he cherished. He accepted it with reverence. "Thank you, Emil. That means a lot." Behind him, Harding slipped his cold hands into his pockets and watched the exchange. The captain had followed rules all his life. Discipline, protocol, proper order, those things had shaped him. But as he observed his men interacting with the civilians, he realized something he had never understood during the war. You can occupy a country with force, but you can only rebuild it through compassion. Nearby, Elsa stood with Lotta, who was finishing the last crumbs of her biscuit. The girl's cheeks were still pale, but the hollow look had softened. She leaned into her mother's coat with a full belly for the first time in days. "Mama," she whispered, "do you think, tomorrow, they will be kind again?" Elsa brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "I don't know, but today was enough to make me believe it's possible." Across the street, Greta, who had struggled most to trust the Americans, held little Annalisa in her arms. The girl had fallen asleep, clutching the cracker packet to her chest. Greta watched the soldiers from a distance, studying every detail of their faces. She expected arrogance, expected coldness, expected something that would confirm her fears. But all she saw were tired young men, working in the freezing cold, handing out supplies not because they were ordered to, but because it was the decent thing to do. She whispered softly, "Michael would have wanted this." Michael, her husband, had believed that mercy was not weakness, even in war. She had forgotten that. She had forgotten many things, but today reminded her. Not far from her stood Heinrich Falmer, the older schoolteacher. He approached Harding with cautious steps, removing his hat as a sign of respect. "Captain," he said in careful English, "I taught children for 30 years. I saw many things. War, hardship, cruelty. But today," he gestured toward the quiet scene around them, "today will be remembered. These children will grow up knowing that their enemy fed them when they were starving. They will not forget." Harding nodded. "I hope so, sir." "It matters," Heinrich continued. "Kindness taught in hunger is remembered longest." As he stepped away, Harding let the words settle in his mind like snowflakes. He had spent years commanding men in battle, calculating risks, anticipating ambushes, confronting death. But here, in the quiet aftermath, he felt something more profound than victory. He felt purpose. The smell of engine fumes drifted through the cold air as the mechanics finally managed to lift the damaged fuel truck back onto stable ground. A cheer went up from the American soldiers, relieved, ready to move on. The convoy was preparing to continue toward the depot, but no one rushed. Everyone understood that leaving meant ending an unexpected moment of humanity. Carver slapped Rourke on the shoulder. "Well, buddy, Looks like we did something good today. Rourke glanced at the wooden rabbit in his hand. Yeah, he said quietly. Better than anything I did in the war. Elsa approached one last time. She held Lotta's hand tightly, her expression calm, but filled with something deep, heavy, emotional. Sir, she said softly to Rourke, I cannot repay what you have done, but I will remember you. My daughter will remember you. Rourke shook his head. You don't owe me anything. But I do, Elsa replied. You gave her food when we had none. That is not something a mother forgets. Lotta stepped forward timidly. Goodbye, she whispered, her voice small in the cold wind. Rourke crouched down, smiling. You stay warm, okay? And take care of your mama. She nodded. The Americans began climbing back into the trucks. The engines rumbled to life one by one, filling the street with their deep mechanical growl. Children stepped back, shielding their eyes from the swirling exhaust. Mothers lifted their little ones into their arms. Fathers nodded solemnly toward the soldiers, still unsure of the future, but certain that today had changed something inside them. As the trucks began to roll forward, civilians lined the street, not in fear, not in silence, but in quiet respect. Some offered small waves. Others simply watched, holding their food tightly. A few whispered Danke once more, letting the word drift after the convoy, like a fragile blessing carried on the winter air. From the back of the truck, Rourke leaned out slightly, scanning the crowd until he found Lotta and Elsa. He lifted a hand in a small wave. Elsa raised her hand too, the gesture simple but profound, and then the convoy rolled on, disappearing slowly into the vast grey of the ruined city, heading toward the depot and the tasks of another long day in a country trying to rebuild itself from ashes. Behind them, in the battered streets of Kassel, civilians began to make their way home, holding tins, biscuits, and a memory they would pass down for generations. The day American soldiers, men they had once feared, men they had been taught were merciless, stopped their convoy and fed their children. In a winter where everything felt broken, that moment was the first crack through which the light returned.